So, welcome to our study, Shechen Gyaltsap Rinpoche's The Great Medicine. And last time we looked at just the introduction and about the basic considerations of how to attend any teaching, really. Also from the point of view of having, you could say, the most benefit from this. So we want to, first of all, generate what we call bodhicitta, motivation, which is appreciating that what we're doing here is not just benefiting us alone, or rather what we're doing here has relevance for everyone. We're getting to the bottom of confusion, and as such, this is something that has tremendous relevance for anybody, any sentient being. And so with the experience that we might gain from the path, we can benefit others. In addition to that, there's a few things that we'd want to remember. We could listen to the teachings with a motivation of, you could say, afflicted motivation, being angry or having some agenda, and so on and so forth with the teaching. And we'd want to make sure that our motivation is pure, and also that we don't forget what it is that we are listening to. So we have this image of the pot. First of all, if we're not listening at all, it's like if the pot was upside down. If we are listening and forgetting things, it's like having a leaky pot. And if we have an afflicted agenda, then it's a bit like pouring something into a pot that has impurity or poison. And finally, we'd want to appreciate, you could say, the sacred context that this is taking place. Even though the last bit of this, you could say, the flow of golden nectar comes through a somewhat rusty pipe, we'd want to appreciate that this is the teaching of the Buddha, that we live in an extraordinary time where the teaching of the Buddha is still here. And the value of this teaching, the purity of us who are attending it, our pure motivation, the possibility that we might be the future Buddhas, and so on. So with this kind of motivation, then we can really benefit from this in a far greater way. And then we discussed how innately we possess what is called Buddha nature. As long as this Buddha nature is not recognized, we wander in samsara, we suffer. But what we want to realize here is that no matter how confused we might be, this nature never changes. And so, in fact, what we're doing right now with this great medicine is recovering from this illness, this delusion that we're having. So just like somebody who's temporarily delusional, perhaps feverish, whatever it might be, having a nightmare, then in fact, the basic goodness, the overall, you could say, sanity of the situation prevails. And so we are operating with the Buddha's teaching, in which the Buddha saw clearly that we suffer unnecessarily and that our situation is highly workable. So today we're going to get more involved with a discussion of the path. So I'm going to turn off the webcam now and we can focus on the text itself. So looking at this Buddha nature, then we are intending to do something about uncovering it. As it is right now, we weave a tangle of confusion, which includes, like we also discussed last time, a diluted experience, which then is what creates our world, our conscious experience, and even our physical body. So this is what we call samsara. Not so much the perceptions, not so much that we have cognition as such, but the fact that it's all tied up and afflicted. So we have a afflicted subjectivity and we have deluded dualistic perceptions. And this is what can be addressed. And so we'd want to appreciate that what the Buddha taught and what is particular for Buddhism is that in that we're not assessing or asserting an external creator as we have it in theistic religions, what we call eternalism, nor do we operate with the idea that the universe is just completely random, as we very often hear in a contemporary, you could say, context. And that's where we have this rather nihilist idea of our world. So the Buddha doesn't operate with these rather disempowering perspectives. Rather, he asserted that our situation is something that's caused. And so the Buddha taught how to put an end to the causes of confusion. Now, many of us are familiar with something we call the Yedama mantra, which is Yedama hetu prabhava hetum tesham tatagato hayawata tesham chayo niroda evambadi mahashramana, which literally means all dharmas originate from causes. These causes were explained by the Tathagata. The cessation of these causes was also explained by the great renunciant. Now, this is something that Shariputra heard from a student of the Buddha. This was before Shariputra became a student of the Buddha. And Shariputra had met him and asked what the Buddha taught. So this is what then this student told him. And we say that Shariputra was so sort of, you could say, aware of what this actually meant, that he attained the first level of, as an arhat, what we call, he became a stream enterer. But anyway, in discussing this path, we have a way to put an end to confusion. And so we would want to understand that what we're doing here in having relevance for all sentient beings, we should have this motivation of caring and compassion as we study. So just one more thing. Obviously, this study here is premised on everyone reading the text. What I'm doing is really just going over the main points, but I don't do it word for word. And if you don't read the text itself, you'll really miss out. I'm assuming you've read this, and so I'm actually, with this, you could say, commentary, addressing reflections that we might have in regard to the text, particularly as practitioners, and also as people inhabiting a very different culture and operating within a very different discourse, a different conceptual universe than, you could say, the context in which this text originally was written. So, chapter 3, preliminaries and refuge. So, this is essentially about what we call the 4 reflections and then taking refuge. But you see, the premise for understanding the 4 mind changes is actually a very different view on consciousness, namely consciousness as the creator of our conditions and our karma, which creates our conditions. And this is where we're now, when we approach the 4 mind changes, we're seriously into practice. We might be attracted by a Buddhist theory, but in the context of the path itself, we operate with a pragmatism that is based on a very different worldview. And here we're looking at how our mind is not an emergent property of the body, as we generally are taught within, you could say, modern science and contemporary belief systems, so on. From that point of view, when we die, that's it. Our consciousness ceases. Now, we saw last time how we weave a delusional triad of experience, which is our world, consciousness, and body, and how this is consciousness, which is primary in creation of this. It's not the body that creates consciousness or something, you could say, neurobiological or what have you. And so we might as well sort of go for the jugular and appreciate that this is really where Buddhist perspective differs from a mechanistic view that we find elsewhere. And you often hear people say things like, wow, Buddhism is so rational. Where did they get this religious reincarnation business from? And some might say, oh, it's cultural or it's just popular beliefs. But no, this is not belief systems. Also in this regard, Buddhism is very rational. It's simply saying that consciousness could never emerge from unconscious systems. Our consciousness is what creates an apparently solid world, an apparently solid conscious perceptions, and an apparently solid body. There is nothing in these objective conditions that possess any solid essential consciousness. On the other hand, consciousness is not tangible, and so there cannot be a cause and effect relationship between unconscious systems and consciousness. Consciousness is verifiably intangible, and it possesses qualities that are not at all related to tangible matter. We can sometimes say there's correlation, but correlation doesn't mean causation. Anyway, this is an extensive discussion, but it's something that comes up in this present context of the four mind changes. We want to appreciate that to believe that matter could miraculously give rise to consciousness is kind of like believing in the stork. There's no real cause and result relationship between the two. So we're essentially believing in something quite miraculously if we believe that inanimate matters could give rise to consciousness. Anyway, that being said then, you'd want to appreciate that, as with all Buddhism, you are encouraged to doubt and analyzing using rationality and reason. But of course, and what some might do is that you might take the easy way out, which is to trust authority, in this case the Buddha, lineage masters, and so forth. And that is the traditional way in a society and culture where you can see this works. But we're coming from a different place, and so the reasoning that we might use could be quite helpful. Again, unless we were, you could say, great yogis, we don't exactly have direct perception of past and future lives. So obviously we're operating with what we call inferential valid cognition. But we do have a lot of stories about people who remember their past lives, and sages like the Buddha describe seeing beyond just this life. Anyway, like I said, this is Buddhism. You're encouraged to investigate and look what it is that makes up consciousness and decide for yourself using reasoning. Anyway, here then we assert that to have the conditions for human rebirth, as it is viewed by those with insight, such as the Buddha, is of course exceedingly rare. But if we should sort of take their word for it, to be born as a human is not dependent on external circumstances. It's dependent on the karma or the seeds of the mind. So sutras such as the Chigala Sutra in the Pali Canon, and also we can read in Words of My Perfect Teacher, tells us how rare a human rebirth is. And then we also reflect on how quickly a life passes, on the suffering inherent to our delusional condition, and how our actions, mental, verbal, and physical, have an impact on our experience. To have these perspectives in place informs us about where we are, which is precious human rebirth, and the urgency of this, the impermanence, the imperative of doing something about this now, which is recognizing the shortcomings of samsara, and exactly what can be done, the actions that we need to take, which is the law of karma. So when we are informed about these aspects, it radically changes our perspectives and our priorities. These reflections, they might be at the beginning of the path, and hence they're called preliminaries. But as we can see in the story that we have here about Gyaltsap Rinpoche and his study with his teacher on these topics, these reflections go very deep, and they provide us with a profound sense then of the value of any path. So then we begin with Shechen Gyaltsap's verses here, and the first is on precious human birth. Now that you have at last obtained this free, privileged human birth, which is so hard to find and so meaningful, it is worthwhile to transform your being in solitude without being attached to this life, which is of such small importance. So, the celestial realms, we could say that the God realms, which is kind of like the Beverly Hills of existence, they're busy with meaningless distractions. The human realm where we are present is free and privileged, and it's very hard to come by. And it has just enough suffering while still allowing us the conditions to practice meaningfully. And this is where Shechen Gyaltsap then advises us it is worthwhile to transform our being in solitude. So practically speaking, for modern people, this means that we need to prioritize this and not be carried away by distractions. Presently, there are not so many, even though they do exist here and there. You could say conditions in which we can retire to viharas or monasteries or retreat centers. Even though we can't do that, we'd want to appreciate the validity of such institutions. Just because we don't have them doesn't mean that we have to, you could say, dismiss them as irrelevant or sort of impossible. Let's pray that such institutions or places can come about, especially thinking how, you would say, we modern people very often are driven by our sort of distractions and have a hard time actually integrating our practice in a busy life. But then again, realistically speaking, then, since we possibly might not right away be going to retreat, it's more a question of really prioritizing and realizing how important it is that we focus on this. So, of course, if we have the opportunity, we do some retreat. But right now, saying that we have a precious human rebirth, we need to then make it precious through our application of the teaching. And in doing so, we're doing something exceedingly important, which is eliminating the confusion that drives samsara. So we shouldn't be too attached to things that are of little consequence, what Shechen Gyaltsap refers to as the things of this life, which are of such small importance. Once we begin to practice, then we realize that this is the most important thing that we could do for ourselves and for everyone. So we'd want to leave our cocoon of habit, as this is what brings us suffering. And of course, we might think, oh, I don't want to leave what is so familiar. It's a bit like birds in a cage, or perhaps children growing up in a restricted context and so on. So we might think this is all we know. But here we are in a different position, and right now, having some awareness of samsara's suffering, we don't want to waste any time getting out. There's absolutely nothing to be had here. The appearance might be okay right now, but our fate is bleak if we stay. We need to look beyond the surface and check out, as Rabjam Rinpoche gives the vivid example of a roadside restaurant in India, we might check out how the curry and the chapatis are actually made. Actually, in a Western context, you should read George Orwell's description in a book he wrote about being down and out in Paris and London. Similar scenario. Anyway, right now there is a chance to escape, so we don't want to waste this opportunity. Amid the clouds of impermanence and illusion, the lightning of life dances. Are you sure you won't die tomorrow? Death is unavoidable, so practice the Dharma. So it's interesting that we're rather apathetic, says Rabjam Rinpoche, in preparing to death, thinking how much we prepare for our vacations and so on. So again, of course, in our culture, we are greatly informed in terms of, or rather, it's not as if it's not as if we are greatly informed in terms of post-death preparation. And very often the institutions that traditionally cater to that, they're very often discredited according to then our existing parameters for valid science. However, death is something that's vivid in a lot of our thoughts. So to link it up with a creative angle of preparing constructively rather than merely having an underlying fear would enable us to appreciate that we have now the possibility of preparing for the inevitable. This is where reflection of death is not morbid, but it's just like having a retirement plan or preparing for taxes. It's just being smart. So we are suggesting here, Shechen Gyaltsap is suggesting that we actively reflect on the fact that we will die, and we want to do something right now. Reflecting on how little we in fact prepare for our death, being a little bit humble about that is essential. So we need to, you could say, up our ante and be more proactive. If we look at the life of great masters and sages, what really was a change in their life was very often an increased awareness of impermanence. So we can do this in terms of, and the words of my perfect teacher has it very systematic. Rabjam Rinpoche here brings in a couple of aspects we can meditate on, the external changes on how cityscapes, how places and locations change. For example, Bodh Gaya, where there used to be great monasteries, which are all gone now. We also can think of great beings that existed or who we knew, and regardless of who these people were, they eventually had to die. So our hanging on still is rather paradoxical. So we need to recognize how we fail to grasp impermanence, and then we need to apply ourselves to meditating on impermanence. In general, we don't bother to cling if we know something doesn't last. So the value of this meditation is only too obvious. We will be less narrow-minded in our attachment, in our fussiness, repulsion, and so on, if we are aware of how short our life is. We have this in our culture notion of carpe diem. There's a famous story about a meditator, Karak Gomchong, who had this bush outside his cave that he ended up never cutting down, even though it would rip his robe every time he went outside. But he just thought, there's no time to deal with this. I better go back and meditate. So we say he never cut the bush, but he did achieve realization. So, since beginningless time, in the prison of existence, you have endured the punishment of the threefold suffering. Yet you remain unconcerned, rotten heart. Now is the time to conquer the citadel of great bliss. So, as long as our basic delusional clinging to self persists, then we will have all the suffering that comes with that, predictably. We will persist in the insecure strategies of self-centered pursuit of happiness and, in fact, reap only suffering. We tend to think that something brings happiness when, in fact, it might end up in suffering. So we might go out in the sun to warm ourselves, but then we get hot. Similarly, happiness changes into suffering. We talk about three kinds of suffering. The suffering of suffering, which is when suffering piles up, suffering of change, which is, as in the example of going out in the sun, pleasure changes to pain, and all-pervasive suffering, which is basic to our condition, our clinging to self. So as long as there is this clinging to a self, we we have this situation, and just going into then all-pervasive suffering, labeling phenomena as good or bad on the basis of this self, then we have various reactive patterns that go with that, namely our afflictions, our attachment, aversion, pride, jealousy, and so on, and this drives our actions. So we, in brief, have what we call kleshas, afflictive reactionary patterns, and then the actions that are driven by these afflictions. So what we call karma and kleshas, and this is what weaves our suffering. This is the stuff of samsara. So we would be stupid not to recognize this and not do something about it. So this is where Shechen Gyaltsap then is quite straightforward, referring to us in our inertia as rotten heart. Now, when we talk about great bliss, this is then the condition that is beyond the delusion of clinging to the self. This is, you can say, enlightenment. So this is where Shechen Gyaltsap encourages us to go. So happiness and suffering are manifestations of karma. You cannot escape the law of cause and effect. So the victorious one has said. Knowing this, discriminate carefully, avoid evil deeds, accomplish virtuous acts. So we carry karma with us. We are in fact a result of all the actions that have created where we are now. So this is not just about this present life, but also future lives and our lives there in terms of those realms, our bodies and so forth that we will inhabit at that time, what we call future rebirth. And this then, as we have discussed earlier, is where Buddhists, they don't believe that everything just conveniently ends at the time of death. There's nothing tangible about the mind that can end. And as such, we'd want to appreciate that the storehouse consciousness carries then the imprints of what has happened in the past, which is what we call karma. So in Buddhism, we don't believe in things like luck or destiny or random chance. So right now, each of us have a present experience, which is the result of our past actions. So this is where we say, if you want to see what you were in the past, look at your body. If you want to see what you will be in the future, look at your actions. So rather than us speculating about what or might not come, what was in the past and so forth, the whole point about karma is to be proactive in establishing the conditions for what we want and to avoid establishing the conditions for what we don't want. So the results are not right away visible. Actions are like seeds that then need particular conditions to manifest. And we have this very sweet story about the pig then that being chased around a stupa by some dogs eventually had the, you could say, auspicious conditions for being reborn as a monk. Now, it's especially when we realize emptiness, when we realize that phenomena are not fixed but are conditioned. That's when we realize that since phenomena they lack any ultimate inherent solid existence, then we realize how everything that we perceive is dependent on cause and effect, what we do. Now, the root of the path then is taking refuge in the three jewels. So having reflected on precious human rebirth, its impermanence, the shortcomings of samsara, and then actions, the value of our actions, then we proceed to do something about it, which is then practice the path. So these first four reflections, they are what we call the common preliminaries, and now we engage in what we call the more specific preliminaries. Let's see if there are any questions. Okay, I find it hard to accept that life has no value other than as an escape route from samsara. What to do? what of life itself? And what we learn here: inspiration, creativity, generosity, unconditional love, sacrifice, joy, friendship. What of the intrinsic value of these experiences? Well, that's exactly it, really. The thing is, when we're caught in samsara, that's when we are blind to this. So what you're mentioning there, in fact, is a reflection of Buddha nature. That we have these, you could say, like Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. That there is, in between, there's cracks in our delusion. We're not always caught up in ourselves. And so, yes, inspiration. Notice how that's actually being open to the other. It's not being self-involved. Creativity, same thing. It's when we're not bogged down by clinging to ourselves. Generosity, that's being proactive in letting go of the self. So unconditional love, same thing. Sacrifice, yes. Joy, friendship. See, all of these, they really are examples of how nirvana continually permeates, or enlightenment, or Buddha nature continually permeates our existence. So this is, in fact, what we want to cultivate. But we also want to highlight that right now we have an extremely, you could say, precious opportunity when we can appreciate these things. And so that's where we want to appreciate precious human rebirth and the urgency of doing something about our situation. Thank you very much. Someone declares their love. That's very kind of them. Then there is, if consciousness is intangible, how can it store karma? Oh, very well. Karma is not something that is how do you say tangible either. And in fact, the very whole nature of our entire existence and experience is not something tangible. The degree to which we are deluded and cling, then we solidify phenomena. But as we can see in terms of just our own personal experience and how we can have, you could say, various emotions that shape our person, none of that is necessarily tangible. And like I said before, there can be a correlation to the tangible, such as brain activity and thoughts and so forth. But innately, we'd want to appreciate that this is something that where we have to work with first-person subjectivity, and you could say, and that's then where the karma is stored. Then someone says, "Look to my body to know the past. So my blue eyes are due to some condition." Could you expand? Oh, yes. In the sutras, the Buddha would say even every color on the peacock's tail is due to karma, due to some condition in the past. And then someone says, what is it meant by looking at your body to see what you've done in the past? Basically, we're just saying that instead of speculating, we can simply see that, for example, having been reborn in the human realm, this is due to some extremely positive conditions. So we understand that we're not just born randomly, and we're not exclusively product of just DNA. Again, there might be some correlation there, but the causation, it has to do with our karma, our consciousness. So yes, just like the blue eyes or the peacock's feather, then our body is created due to our past actions. So is there some level of faith required? No. In Buddhism, our initial approach is doubt. We reason, we investigate. But of course, a lot of us believe that there were some people on the moon in 1969, and some people say these were just some studios in Burbank that created this impression. So yes, someone like myself, I have some blind faith in institutions like NASA, and we might have some blind faith in institutions like Buddhism. But if we were to investigate, we would probably find that we could make some rational assertion in regard to these questions. So as far as karma and everything else goes, this is something that we can assert through reasoning. If karma is intangible, intangible is heaven. I don't know about that. If we agree that heaven is intangible, how can someone who is highly learned come up with good description of it? I'm not really sure where heaven comes in. Heaven is a funny Christian term. We don't really talk about heaven in Buddhism. We talk about pure realms, which is essentially pure, undiluted perception. So, for example, in Buddhism, we talk about pure realms, which is the scope of those with little delusion. Just like you could say, on a good day, when we're feeling good, we experience a very friendly world, and on days where we're very uptight, we feel an antagonistic world around us. So all of this is again produced by, you could say, the intangible consciousness. Okay, I'll continue now. So if you have more questions, just write them, and we'll do some Q&A at the end. So the root of the path, refuge in the three jewels. Rely upon the undeceiving embodiment of all refuges, the unexcelled three jewels. Just hearing their names shatters the city of existence. So we realize how fragile we are, how we suffer, and that something can be done. We recognize that we are in a humble position of being confused, and we need protection. So this is where we go for refuge. Now, the object of refuge then is the Buddha, and the Buddha is basically, etymology is someone who is purified, Bud, and Da supposedly I think means developed, fully developed. Sang and Gye in Tibetan. Sang meaning purified and Gye developed. So we say the Buddha is purified of all delusion and the qualities of enlightenment are fully manifest. We take refuge then also in the Dharma, which is both the Dharma of transmission and its realization. The Sangha, which are the companions that have insight and liberation. Jiktrul Niden. So to elaborate on that then, we would say that, again, as before, the one who has purified the two veils and has developed the two wisdoms. The two veils are emotional obscuration and cognitive obscuration. The two wisdoms are knowing reality as it is and knowing reality as it appears to the various sentient beings. Then Dharma, as far as transmission goes, this is what the Vidyadhara Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche said, what has been heard, and realization is what has been experienced. I always like that definition. And the Sangha then are these qualities of knowledge and liberation. So taking refuge is going through a door. It's entering the Buddhist path. And this is eventually then what will lead to the fruition of realizing Buddha nature. Now, this third chapter on developing the awakened mind is really going to the heart of what enlightenment is all about. When we say practicing the Mahayana, which is what Rabjam Rinpoche says, when we say that, we're actually meaning attaining enlightenment. And to do so, then, we need to remove the principal obscuration, which is this delusion of fixating on a self. And we can do this in countless ways, but it's important to realize it is not about negating or suppressing or imposing some moralistic regime on ourselves. This is not about behavior. When we discuss things like bodhicitta, compassion and so forth, this is about awakening, seeing through a hoax, an error in our judgment and practice. So the Buddha taught countless methods to remedy this. So here we are approaching this through invoking an innate disposition that lies beyond the scope of our habitual attitudes, insecurities, and neuroses. A natural intelligence that is an expression of our Buddha nature. And this is what we then call bodhicitta. It literally means heart of enlightenment, heart of Bodhi. So this is the core that we innately possess, a sort of a magnanimity, a greatness. But presently it needs to be recognized and developed. And like in the question before about our generosity or creativity and so forth, our joy, this is something that we continually have, but we'd want to recognize and develop it. There is a marked difference between a great sage and us. We share the same joys in some way, but the sage might have a little bit more of it. The sage might have a little bit more creativity. So there's something to be learned. So as we see it in others, we rejoice in it. So we see things like truthfulness or straightforwardness or courage and so forth. So we want to go beyond just recognizing and rejoicing in this to actively cultivate and develop this disposition. So the way to do this, as Rabjam Rinpoche describes, is then to abandon the limited project of our own happiness and be aware of instead the happiness of others, making that our main interest, shifting our interest to others' happiness. And as Shantideva then defines bodhicitta in the way of the bodhisattva, bodhicitta, that is the wish to establish all sentient beings in enlightenment. Now, who is more shameless in this world than one who abandons to samsara's ocean of suffering all the mothers who have tenderly cared for him since beginningless time, and instead strives towards the peace of a solitary nirvana? So we could again say here we're again talking about reincarnation as we've discussed it above. And following that lead then, we have had countless lifetimes with countless sets of parents. So it would be shameless abandoning our parents, and even in ordinary human values of caring for someone who has been good to us is seen as shameless. Then again, in our culture, we have a rather common practice of establishing a link between our personal suffering and certain actions of our parents. And so some people have difficulties with this practice. And so even though it's found in most other cultures and is tied up with revering elders and so forth, for some of us it's difficult. And I remember skillfully Dinghu Chensa Rinpoche, when he visited Denmark in 1976, he was telling us that we can alternatively view all sentient beings as our children. Anyway, I would suggest that we think of someone we perceive as having been of great benefit to us, someone who has helped us selflessly. But anyway, in the present discussion, we will work with this image of the selfless and caring mother. So we want to recall her kindness to us throughout countless lifetimes, looking after us, and at this time always being completely selfless in feeding, protecting, educating us, and so forth. So we would want to see ourselves and all beings really connected in this way as child and parent. And all these beings then, shouldn't we work for them, for their happiness, since that we now have some extraordinary present circumstances where we have encountered great teachers and we have the teaching. So this is an opportunity where we could bring an end to suffering. Now, this discussion, it also alludes to those who have some achieved spiritual peace. It says here a solitary nirvana. These are beings who decide to remain in that peace and not worrying about the suffering of others. These are what we call arhats, who then decide to stay in gokpa or nirodha. Now the bodhisattvas, they refuse this and they renounce then nirvana. So we talk about the bodhisattvas as fearing actually nirvana. We say the bodhisattvas fear samsara, but they fear even more nirvana. So recognizing then the suffering there is in the universe to leave sentient beings behind then is why what Shechen Gyaltsap refers to as shameless. For countless kalpas, those with sublime intelligence and their heirs have investigated and seen with their mighty wisdom that precious bodhicitta alone is of major benefit. So this then refers to the Buddhas and their heirs, being the bodhisattvas, the men and women who realized that the sole remedy for suffering is this compassion that wishes all to become enlightened, bodhicitta. And they have then made this their sole, you could say, agenda. Rabjam Rinpoche encourages us, saying, strive to follow in their footsteps and develop the precious enlightened mind as they did. So when we talk about bodhicitta, we talk about relative and absolute bodhicitta. The absolute bodhicitta is realization of emptiness, realization of the reality of things. This doesn't mean that there's nothing, but it just means that right now we have a perception, a delusion of clinging to self as solid and our perceived perceptions as solid. And so this is where the Buddha, just like someone who tells us as we're being gripped by a movie, tells us this is just a movie, then likewise also we need to realize emptiness. So when we then gradually have this realization, this is then absolute bodhicitta. Relative bodhicitta is also going beyond this clinging to a self, but it's rooted in, you could say, relative reality. And this is where we then generate kindness and compassion for others. And this is then done in terms of first generating an aspiration, wishing to do something, and then application, actually doing something. So for this relative bodhicitta then, we say, if among all the paths to the ultimate goal, you tread this one and open the treasury of the twofold aim, what other witness will you need? Following either of the two traditions? Generate bodhicitta as a vow and as an action. Learn its precepts, the detailed and the concise, the general and the specific, and put them earnestly into practice. So relative bodhicitta is to generate the aspiration to establish all sentient beings in enlightenment. That's the aspiration. And we then carried it out. Now this achieves the twofold benefit of securing the happiness of others as well as our own happiness. Now to consolidate our commitment to this path, we take the Bodhisattva vow in the presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. This vow makes us part of a lineage of Bodhisattvas. So in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, we speak of two lineages, the profound Madhyamika lineage from Nagarjuna and the vast Yogacharya lineage from Asanga. Actually, as an aside, I should mention that there is a third Bodhisattva lineage mentioned by a great Tibetan master called Getse Mahapandita, who speaks of a third lineage that went to China, and that's then the Bodhisattva lineage that comes from Bodhidharma. And this actually is a lineage that Bodhidharma received from the lineage of Nagarjuna. So this is referred to as the absolute lineage of blessing and is basic to what we call Chan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. But the Tibetans, they mainly operate with these two other Bodhisattva lineages then, which is what we call the Madhyamika and Yogacharya lineages. So once we take the Bodhisattva vow according to either of these two traditions, we then begin to practice the three trainings, which is then Shila, you could say ethics or discipline, Samadhi, concentration or meditation, and Prajna, wisdom. Now the benefits of awakening bodhicitta. Consider the difference between the Buddhas who accomplished the benefit for others and we ordinary beings whose goal is our own benefit. even at the cost of your life. Don't give up bodhicitta. So this is very similar to something we find in the Way of the Bodhisattva, also in the chapter on meditation, the 8th chapter, where Shantideva says, "Is there need for lengthy explanations? Childish beings look out for themselves. Buddhas labor for the good of others. See the difference that divides them." So we tend to be primarily concerned with our own happiness, our own well-being, and we operate from the assumption that this will bring us satisfaction. Only it is so obvious that this is not the case. We see Buddhas and sages do exact opposite, namely being primarily concerned for others, and we can see the difference. They achieve enlightenment, fulfill the needs of both others and themselves, both temporarily and ultimately. So we might feel that the ultimate objective is beyond us, but at the same time we can experience a palpable difference of our person if we shift or raise our primary concern or perspective from being centered on ourselves to actually include others. This is not about being a martyr or a doormat. It's really about addressing a narrowness that we needn't be stuck with, especially after we recognize how counterproductive it is, and after recognizing the values of the inspiration we can gain from great beings such as the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So practically speaking, we begin with slowly generating love and compassion, and we especially check our grounds, our motivations. And we want to check how much of our motivation is tied up with, with self-centered agendas, and this enables greater compassion. Since bodhicitta is the very root of the ocean-like activity of the bodhisattvas, know it to be the crux of all trainings, the root of the Mahayana path. If you have bodhicitta, you will go on the right path. All that you do, even neutral actions, will turn into virtue, and you will never stray from the path of total liberation. So, from now on, bodhicitta has to permeate our attitudes and be present in all practice and all actions of body, speech, and mind. If it is, then anything, no matter how trivial, becomes part of the path. We don't need to feel resentful about any activity or feel that our path is hindered by non-dharmic circumstances. From the moment we generate bodhicitta, it's not as if there ever is a time when we're not practicing. Saying basically, not practicing is not an option if we have this bodhicitta. Now, without bodhicitta, whatever you do will keep you on the lesser path. Even your virtuous deeds will perpetuate samsara. Not to speak of neutral and other deeds. Whatever you do, it will all be suffering. So again, actions in themselves are neither good nor bad. Now, this is something that hopefully we don't need to elaborate on. Anything that we do can be seen as being either good or bad, depending on where we're seeing from. This pretty much goes for anything. But what we want to see in terms of the value of our actions has to do with the motivation behind the action. So we need to look beyond the action itself and check what our motivation is. If there is bodhicitta, we can trust our motivation and we have no regret. If, on the other hand, we're merely concerned with ourselves, then no matter how virtuous an action might seem, it will have far lesser beneficial impact. Therefore, you must examine your mind again and again with presence, awareness, and concern. Never think that it is a small offense to break minor precepts. Again, the path requires that we check for selfish motivation and we're proactive in generating love and compassion, that we continually remember the kindness of others, how they assist our path, and often suffer due to their confused action. So, the Bodhisattva vow. Having asked the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to give you their attention, you don the armor of vowing to liberate all beings, thus gladdening gods and men. So if you deceive them now, what will become of all these sentient beings? So when we take the Bodhisattva vow, we have the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as our witness. We request the vow 3 times, and we then we request that we 3 times we request this from the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions. And we ask them to essentially bear witness to our promise. And what we're doing is, you could say, donning the armor of courage and determination. The greatness, or the, you could say, stubbornness to want to benefit all sentient beings. Now, as far as this project goes, there's nothing greater. There's no objective that brings more joy. It brings joy to everyone. And that is if we stick to our commitment. But then again, there's nothing, no greater failure. There's no greater waste if we don't persevere in this vow. On the other hand, we shouldn't be too worried about this, because there's no reason why we should not be able to do it. There's nothing really that holds us back. It has been said, Shechen Gyaltsap continues, that through perseverance, even bees and flies can achieve enlightenment. Why should you, a human being, lack courage? So we might feel overwhelmed by the task without having done anything actually so far. So we could talk about that as being sort of a despondency or an aspect of laziness. The task itself is not at all impossible. That what really is the problem is our apprehension, not wishing possibly to leave our cocoon or our comfort zone. So while we might be venturing into unfamiliar ground, we have to think, what exactly do we have to lose? Are we afraid of losing our suffering? So we need to counteract this attitude with perseverance and determination. We can progress from the dullness of the animal realm to the intelligence of the human realm, and through the paths and level to enlightenment. Hence we say even bees and flies. Why give up now all the conditions of our why give up now all the conditions of our why would we why give up all the but basically it's saying that right now we have all the conditions, so we needn't be, you could say, despondent, think that we can't do it. Right now we have all the conditions. So with familiarity, everything gets easier. Repeating your efforts over and over, you must train your mind. So the Tibetan word for meditation is actually gompa, which should be understood as meaning familiarization. So with the practice, what we're doing is simply familiarizing ourselves with this vision that we are familiar with, that we know, but yet we need to cultivate it. We have some, you could say, inspiration or some view, but we need to actually integrate this fully. So that's what we mean with this familiarization. So meditation doesn't mean that we're going off into something that we don't know where we're going. It's simply claiming this innate ground, our Buddha nature. So appreciating this through our recognition of the qualities such as kindness, compassion, and so forth, we would want to further experience this. So we might have some reticence and some hesitation, not really want to leave our stuffy space. But this is where we need to be heroic and where we need to take inspirations from the Bodhisattvas. So we take the vow, we contemplate it as part of our practice, and we then enhance it further in post-meditation. So that brings us to the end of the discussion on the chapters 3 and 4. So I'm just going to check if there's any questions. And also I have a little something afterwards also. Okay, there's a misprint somewhere. So okay, I'll come back to that. Thank you very much. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any other questions right now. So I just thought to have a little slideshow since a few days ago, the 6th of July, I believe, it was somebody's birthday. And this person being a great inspiration for all of us, I thought to just show a few pictures, really. We're lucky that what we're operating with here is not just the notion of bodhicitta is not just an abstract, but we actually have bodhicitta embodied in many great sages, and particularly, of course, most visibly in the modern world is His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So please join me here in congratulating His Holiness on his 80th birthday. And here's a few pictures then. And particularly, there's a long life prayer, which is, it has actually been around for, I think, several generations of Dalai Lamas. So, so we can chant this together, if you like. In this pure realm, surrounded by snow mountains, is the source of complete happiness and benefit. Avalokiteshvara, Tenzin Gyaltsap, may you stand firm until the end of existence. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. So, thank you very much, and we meet again next week.